So Tom, I'm really excited about today. We have been getting into the progressive idea. This is our second week that we've been putting out our progressive idea toolbox.
Right.
And I want to dig a little bit further into progressivism because I think I had actually an interesting conversation with some of our Poor Richards and Guardians after a recent chapter event. Mm-hmm. And it came to my attention how much we look at things and as a culture, especially those on the freedom side of things, who say, I'm afraid of socialism, I'm afraid of communism. They say, oh, they're just trying to hide democratic socialism behind the word democracy to make it sound better. But no one really speaks up about progressivism. You had Hillary Clinton fighting, I'm the strongest progressive. Barack Obama saying, no, I'm the strongest progressive. Then in 16, when you had Hillary running, I'm a strong progressive. You had Bill Clinton, I'm a strong progressive.
You know, there's actually an interesting, the history of that word over the last century, a little more than 125 years or so. When you go back to the late 19th century, 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s, that word was quite fashionable. Woodrow Wilson, for example, would write entire essays on what progress means. That concept of progress was so attractive. And that really goes through the 1920s until you get to FDR and the New Deal. FDR didn't talk about progress, that word, nearly as much as his predecessors did. FDR really co-opts the word liberal.
Okay.
He starts to use that word liberal, and what in the FDR New Deal, I'm talking 1930s, 1940s, what he meant by liberal, of course, he was certainly not thinking of himself as a classical liberal, a Lockean liberal, or Adam Smith liberal. He meant it more in the ancient sense of liberality, generousness. We're generous. That's what it means to be a liberal, to be a New Dealer, is to be generous, which of course means voting for lots of big government programs, and we're going to be generous with other people's money, right? We're going to tax it and take it from them. And so that word liberal really becomes central in our politics, especially when you look at the 1960s, 1970s, even into the 1980s in the age of Reagan. Opponents of Reagan, critics of Reagan would refer to themselves as liberal. And it's not until the 90s where that notion of progress starts to come back. And I give a lot of credit to the Clintons for starting to kind of reintroduce that term progress or progressive back into our politics. And so today it's quite prominent. It's as fashionable among leftists, if not more so than the word liberal, I think.
And we saw that as the 18 or 19 or 25 or 50 or however many Democratic candidates there were in the primary for the 2020 election. They were fighting over who is the most progressive on the stage. Elizabeth Warren or Eric Swalwell or Kamala Harris. They were all fighting who is the most progressive in the group, trying to follow in the Clinton footsteps.
Yes, I think that's right.
And I still can't seem to get past how did we, as freedom-loving people, we get so worked up every time we hear somebody talk about socialism or communism, and we reference Venezuela or we reference Russia or we reference China, yet progressivism is the same ideology. I think we talked about this in the last podcast. Mm-hmm. It's the same basic ideology that led to Nazi Germany.
That's right.
And we've let them get away with this for decades.
Yeah, it is one of the. Well, you're a branding guy, and so you'll appreciate this, right? In terms of political branding, it was kind of a stroke of political genius to choose that word progress, to say we're gonna brand everything we do as progress or progressive, because how do you oppose that, right? If you were to ask ordinary people, who here is for making progress? I mean, everybody's going to say, count me in, man. Right? Making progress sounds great. It sounds, if by definition, it must be better to make progress.
Right.
And it has been progressivism as a body of coherent political, philosophic, moral thought. It has been the single most influential doctrine over the last, I would go back all the way and say 150 years, the last 150 years, even things like the rise of Bolshevism and then eventually the Soviet Union, communism in China, Marxism, socialism, all these they're all variants of progressivism. They all begin with the progressive idea. And that might be a little shocking to some people. I know academics, intellectuals will try to parse out these distinctions, and they'll say, well, socialism is defined by the state ownership of property. Communism is very different, completely different, because communism means abolishing private property. And then you get into things like fascism. Fascism means government command of private property. There's still private property.
Sure.
Legally, technically, but the government's going to command what happens. And my general response to those tidy little neat, nifty definitions is balderdash, hogwash. That's nonsense. At the end, they're all the same thing. Take fascism, for example. If the government comes along and says, Dave, here's the way you've been running your business. We're commanding you. You're going to do something very different. You're going to start producing parts for our tanks. And if you don't, we're just going to take it from you. Right? At that point, is that really your business? Is that your property when the government has that kind of authority to command, control, take it from you? And so in the end, I'm suggesting that these distinctions are not very meaningful. They're not very important. They're all, the example I like to use, if a government agent has a boot on your neck and is pointing a machine gun at you, does it really matter if he calls himself a fascist or a socialist or a communist or a progressive?
Well, we're seeing, you talk about it from the academic standpoint, but we see the same thing in politics, right? That was what Bernie was all about. I'm a democratic socialist, not a socialist.
Right.
I like their form of socialism, not their form of socialism. We're not going to see what happened in Venezuela or Russia. We're going to see, or Nazi Germany. We're going to see something at the end. But at the end of the day, even socialism, socialism, fascism, communism, they're all that basic form born out of progressivism.
Progressivism. And, here, maybe this would be helpful for our listeners, is to boil down the progressive idea to its essence. That we're suggesting all these isms, socialism, communism, they're all just variations of this idea. At its core, the idea of progressivism is the idea of central planning. It's the idea, and I'm a little sympathetic to at least the seduction, the temptation, because you can kind of follow the thinking. Thoughtful people would look at complicated, say, pieces of machinery, pieces of engineering, a clock, a car, a computer, and think, well, some smart people had to design that, right? A clock just doesn't happen by nature, by chance.
Right.
You got to have a clock maker, a clock designer. So if we can engineer a clock, engineer a computer, engineer a car, a society is a really complex thing. Why don't we go ahead and engineer society? And that's sort of that's the driving central basic idea of progressivism. We will gather some smart people together, and they are going to engineer society, design, plan things for us. And that way nothing's left to chance. And it's a much more intelligent way. It's a much more scientific way of living, because it turns out most people aren't experts in much. Many people aren't experts in anything. And so why have stupid, foolish people making their own decisions about important things, food, clothing, shelter, education, medicine, when we'll have smart people planning those things for them? Now, when you look at that idea, and then you start looking around the world, it turns out the communist regimes, the progressive regimes, the socialist regimes, the fascist regimes, they are all variations of that one central basic idea.
And that one central basic idea is central planning.
Yes.
Right? And you talk about that throughout the toolbox videos. We've talked about it on podcasts before, but this central idea that there should be a small group of people, whether it's one or a few or a few dozen, who are making the decisions and trying to understand the needs and the wants and the desires and what people should be given and what should be taken away.
And I'm inclined to say right now in the United States, I actually think growing numbers of people are attracted to that notion of central planning. I think there are, especially young people, enamored with technology, software, computers. I think there are many young people who think, yeah, that sounds right.
Well, I think we started a podcast about that. It was probably our second or third. It might have even been the first, now that I think about it, where I was sitting around a fire pit with a friend, or with a friend of a friend who was in from out of town, who was talking about wanting these communes where you had a bracelet on your wrist and you had to be approved to get in, and you could be removed by the committee of people who ran this thing. And while you're in there, once you're in there, you had a bracelet and you'd walk around and you'd go into the kitchen and it would scan it and it would decide what you needed for nourishment that day. And then you would be given that food and it would decide what you need. Where I find this funny or where I find them confused is his entire purpose. Literally, he said to me, his entire purpose was to start creating more value around things like art and music. And that's why he wanted this. He wanted a society where needs were fulfilled by central planners.
I see.
So that the people could have more time to focus on art and more time to focus on music and more time to focus on personal expression rather than the work that needed to be done.
There's actually a passage from Karl Marx, very similar to that, where Marx is thinking about what life will be like for the communist man in the real communist future, the communist utopia. Once private property is abolished and gone, and we really are living as a commune, each of our interests is inseparable from the interests of the community. And he gives this account where, he'll get up in the morning, maybe do a little farming, maybe have some lunch, do a little hunting or fishing in the afternoon, read a book, write some poetry in the evening, practice his art, right? There's going to be lots of leisure time to exercise the creative, artistic sides of our souls, because all of our needs are going to be taken care of by these communist paradises. And then you think about what actually happens in real communist regime. Everyone's spending their entire days trying to chase around cats and bugs because they don't have any food. They're hungry.
Well, and even if they could figure out, even if we could find a way to provide everyone the nourishment they needed, right? You end up finding it in a way that can be done through mass production, that can be done easily. Everybody ends up wearing the same clothes. Everybody ends up eating the same food. You might engineer the food as technology gets better. You might engineer the food to have different nutrients or different things in it to fit the person's body type if you can do it through technology. But it's not like I can walk in and say, okay, it's telling me I need more protein today. Well, let me go through the menu and figure out what kind of steak it's going to cook me and how I want my steak cooked.
Right.
It's all about doing things in order. And on top of that, I think people forget that all of those things that they need to create art, a paintbrush, a pencil, they have to be produced.
Yes.
And they have to be produced by a lot of different people. I'm reminded of an old Milton Friedman lecture in which he holds up a pencil and he says, how many people in this room could make this pencil?
Well, that comes from a famous essay, I Pencil by Leonard Reed. And it's by the way, we should recommend this. It's a beautiful little essay. You can pull it up online, I Pencil, and it's very short. It's only a few pages long.
Right.
And it's the life of a pencil. This is going to sound a little silly. It is a little silly, but it's a great rhetorical device. It's the life of a pencil told from the pencil's point of view, how the pencil came to be. And it turns out no one person can actually make a pencil, knows how to make a pencil, because you start looking at all the elements, the graphite in the middle, the wooden part, the paint, the little metal band that holds the eraser, the material of the eraser. And all of a sudden you realize there are elements that are needed from all around the world. And to gather those elements require all kinds of machinery And to make those machines require, and so very quickly you see this network of people required to make a pencil grows into the thousands and millions all around the globe, interacting, trading with each other in order to produce a pencil. Incredible complexity, and that's just a pencil. So imagine something like a computer,
right,
or a car, or something really complex.
Well, and we've seen that with computers, right? Who's going to make the computer and all of the components that are going to actually determine what somebody needs? And those are human beings, which we've established throughout this entire conversation from day one, and is a fundamental aspect of understanding the Vino Veritas Society, right, that human beings are not perfect.
That's
human
right.
beings are imperfect, and human beings have desires, and sometimes we seek reason, and sometimes we give in to our desires. And there's always going to be that person who's the maker of the computer, who's going to say, I can rig this computer, and I can make sure this person gets something more than that person in order to get a better life for myself.
I can help my friends and hurt my enemies using my power here as a central planning bureaucrat. So there are two basic fundamental problems here. When our members are engaged in conversations with people promoting socialism or some form of progressivism, some form of central planning, there are two foundational problems. In fact, these problems are so basic, they're primordial. They're inseparable from human nature. You just put your finger on one. It's the problem of moral fallibility. As soon as you give someone that kind of power over other human beings, it doesn't matter how smart they are, it doesn't matter what their background is, there's always that temptation to misuse power. It's why power is always dangerous in any set of human hands. And when you give a few human beings that kind of power to basically plan out the lives of others, the chances of that power being abused, either to hurt people that they want to hurt or to help, some crony friends or help themselves, it's irresistible. The other problem is in any kind of central planning scheme, no matter what the label is, they can say this is progressive, they're up on a stage for a democratic presidential debate, or they can call it socialist or democratic socialist, or any kind of label. A central planning scheme suffers from an intractable knowledge problem. It's inherent in it. Because the fact is, no human being, no central planner can know everything he needs to know for hundreds, thousands, millions of other people to lead good lives, to actually be happy. And this isn't a critique of the central planner. It doesn't mean the central planner is stupid. The central planner might be a very smart, very thoughtful person, but there's no way. The problem is intrinsic to the human mind. The human mind, I like to bring up Socrates a lot as a kind of a point of reference. Socrates was famous for one simple statement. Probably most of our members know it, right? He would say over and over, he knows one thing, that he doesn't know. He was aware, he was conscious, he had knowledge of his lack of knowledge. And it's a very curious phrase, right? To say, I know that I don't know. Right. He's not saying he knows nothing. He does know something. And what he knows is that his knowledge is inadequate, including the knowledge of himself. When he was put on trial, they asked him, why do you do what you do, Socrates? You walk around, you ask these annoying questions, right? Especially to the smart people, the scientists, the judges, the priests of Athens, the people who were the most educated, were the most authoritative. Socrates would listen to a speech and then would ask these questions. He would point out, you just said A and then you said B, and A and B contradict each other. Are you confused? This was Socrates. And his answer when he was asked, why do you do what you do? He referred to the famous oracle at Delphi, which had an inscription, to know thyself. And he said, look, I'm just trying to figure out what I am, because the gods commanded me to try to know myself, and to know what I am means to know, the world around me, to know myself. And he couldn't even figure out, he could not fully understand his own mind, because his own mind is this free phenomenon. It can't be explained in terms of cause and effect, otherwise it wouldn't be a free thing. And so he didn't fully understand himself. how could he possibly fully understand another human being or 300 million other human beings to plan out every detail of their lives, when the truth is their lives are changing all the time, every one of us, right? Minute to minute, hour by hour, day by day.
Yes.
Our wants, our needs, what's going on, problems that we experience, things, new ambitions, all kinds of things change. There's no way, if I was in charge of planning your life, just one person, right? I couldn't do it. There's no way I could know everything about you to be able to plan your life out. In fact, I don't even do a very good job planning my life out, right? Think about that. Think of how hard it is just to try to take care of yourself, much less to have that audacity to say, I'm going to plan the education, healthcare, food, transportation, communications, everything for 300 million people. It can't be done.
Well, so what happens when you start trying to do that? When you start trying to plan out the activities, the actions, the way people dress, the way they eat, and everything else, you start trying to do things at scale.
Yes.
Right? Your first inclination is to say, okay, everybody is going to dress the same way. Everybody's going to eat the same thing. And everybody's going to get the same shoes. Everybody's going to get the same haircut. Everybody's going to do the same thing.
Right.
I get that I'm getting a little Orwellian right now, but that's really what happens under central planning. And so when you get to that point, then you all of a sudden have those outliers. And when you start having those outliers who the shoes don't fit, they need a size shoe. Or
by the way, I have to encourage people, just go Google Soviet era Russian shoes. You can find these images online. They're the most horrific, ugly-looking shoes. They're uncomfortable look. I mean, they look miserable, and they were, and because they were mass-produced by people who said, "I think this is what everyone should wear."
And you wonder if you went to Nike tomorrow, and you said, "Nike, you're going to produce shoes for everybody in the country, and everybody's going to wear Nike shoes, but we're only going to pay you $5 per pair, no matter what.
Right?
You're getting $5 per pair." Are they going to continue to make every shoe in all these different colors and with all these different sizes and shapes and special editions? And are they going to go engage Michael Jordan to make Air Jordans or anything else? Or are they going to say, okay, what's the most basic shoe we can make for the lowest cost possible to make the largest margins possible on the $5 we're making on each pair of shoes?
That's right.
And so everybody's going to start getting the same pair of shoes. Everybody's going to get the same shirt or pants or whatever it might be.
Whether they fit or not, whether they're comfortable or not. That's right.
And then what do you do when people start complaining?
Boy, they become a problem, don't they?
And that's what we've seen in every single socialist, communist, fascist regime in the history of the world.
In fact, this is a great point. In a centrally planned regime, a complainer, someone who doesn't like the medicine that the government has given them or the house that the government has provided or anything, the complainer becomes a problem. And in some cases, maybe such a problem, it's just easier to whack them off, kill them, or send them to some gulag or slave camp or something like that. But in a free society where people are free to be entrepreneurial, are free to be productive and creative, a complainer becomes an opportunity. One of my good friends, he loves the saying that capitalism hates a void. And it's true, right? When there's someone out there who's complaining, says, I don't like these shoes, or I don't like these clothes, or I don't like this kind of computer, there will be some creative entrepreneurial type says, hey, I can make something you'll like. Tell me what you don't like about that other thing, what you would like, and I'll make it, and we'll trade. So the way we see each other, right, within a free society, we see people with different wants and needs as opportunities. In a centrally planned regime, they're a problem to be dealt with. The only question is how to deal with them.
Which you would likely make the argument that that's how they backed into their view on natural rights, right? The progressives, through all of the other socialists, communists, fascists, progressives, we go back to Charles Merriam saying you don't have a natural right to life.
Right.
Your right to life is dependent on how civilized you are as a person.
And he makes it real clear, and it comes from government.
Right.
Those in government decide what kind of rights you're going to have.
And he uses the term civilized. Civilized is likely how much do you fit into our box
That's right.
of what defines what we can mass produce for for everybody. And if you fit outside of that, you're uncivilized, and therefore you don't have a right to life. You don't have a right to freedom, and we have no moral conundrum in getting rid of you.
Well, and you've just put your finger on something really important. Going back to that initial temptation of the progressive idea that complex machineries, they do need to be designed, a clock, a computer, a car. And that's the temptation. A lot of smart people think, yeah, let's think about a society in the same way, and let's engineer and design it. Here's the rub. Do you want to be thought of as a human being? Do you want to be thought of as just a gear or a spring that's very expendable, right? Hey, if this gear breaks, you throw that away and you get another gear and stick it into the clock to make the clock work. Mm-hmm. And it's rather fascinating when you read through central planners of the 19th century into the 20th century and beyond. They tend to talk about human beings as just the material that the central planners are going to use to make their masterpiece, their engineering project, which is an entire society. In one of his essays, Woodrow Wilson describes human beings as nothing but clay. He uses that phrase, nothing but clay. They are the material that the progressive leaders, the central planners, are going to mold and shape and make them conform to whatever the planners need so that they can mass produce and mass design, mass engineer an entire society. You're just an instrument to be used by someone else.
So this is where the irony comes in today's politics, right? We have progressives claiming that the right is racist, xenophobic, homophobic, all of these things, when in actuality, the entire basis of the progressives' political agenda is we are going to shape all of you to be exactly the same. And if you don't fit in, you're not entitled to the same rights as everybody.
You're exactly right. They stand, well, I would put it this way. Progressives reject the foundational idea of justice. The foundational idea of justice is recognition of the humanity, the human nature of fellow human beings, and the natural rights that every other human being. That's the beginning point of justice, right? That's why it's wrong for me to steal from you or to hurt for you, or and vice versa, because we recognize we're human beings. Progressives reject that. Say that's not right. Human beings do not have equal natural rights, and yet they are moralists. They want to instruct others on what's right and what's wrong, what's fair and unfair, what's just and unjust, after they have abandoned the very core idea of justice itself. It's one of the reasons when, I never let progressives take the moral high ground. I never let them assume the moral high ground. The way I always open discussions is shame on you. Shame on you for being you have abandoned the principle of justice. And all you have to do is scratch the surface a little bit whenever progressives are talking about whether it's their plan to save the climate or to save brown people or black people or women or children or some special group that they want to give something to. And you ask the question, well, why? Why? And they'll say, well, that's the right thing to do. Why? Why is it the right thing to do? And usually they can't provide an answer because they're not going to go back to that foundational idea of equal natural rights. Because if you begin with that, then you end up with things like a limited constitutional government that just protects our natural freedom.
Right.
You end up with things like equal protection of the laws, and if you're one of the leaders in government, and all you're doing is enforcing equal protection of the laws, then there's no opportunity to throw some crony favors to your friends over here, or to use that power to punish some of your enemies over here. It's equal protection of the law. There's very little that those in government can actually do.
So it takes us back to that fundamental idea of preserving the Constitution, because without it, where do we end up? Right? We have now gotten to a point where we have Joe Biden saying, if you can't figure out whether or not to vote for me or Donald Trump, you ain't black, right? He's now put them in a box. Right. This is your box now, and you're going to fit in this box.
Right.
And if you don't fit in this box, you are not civilized. You don't deserve rights. You don't have a right to life, to liberty, to property, to the pursuit of happiness, however you want to define that.
You can't even define yourself, right? If a black woman says, I'm a black woman, defines herself as a black woman, Joe Biden has the audacity to say, no, you're not black. I don't care what you think about yourself. You're not black if you don't vote for me.
But if you do vote for me and you want to identify as black, even if you're not black,
that's right.
That's okay, right? If you're Rachel Dolezal,
right,
and you say I identify as black, I want to fit in that box that you've drawn for me,
and vote for Joe Biden,
and vote for Joe Biden. I'm going to vote for Joe Biden because it's part of what defines me in that box. You have shaped me into that mold of clay, and I am embracing a very specific way of life that fits within the box that you're telling people. Yep. And it's a use of force that we don't talk about enough, right? We talk about taxes and we talk about police powers and we talk about all the ways the government uses force.
Right.
But the real act of force by progressives is sitting there saying, if you don't fit into the box that we have created, you don't get rights. Mm-hmm. So I don't care if you're born black or you're not born black. I don't care if you're born feeling this way about something or that way about something. If you don't feel the way the box says, you lose your access to rights.
We in government have defined what it means to be black. And so if you act that way, then you're black. And if you don't act that way, then you're not. It really depends on us conforming to the scheme, the design, the engineering plans of the central planners. And there's another piece of this. I want to turn this in a little more personal context. We modern Americans, we're enamored with the whole subject of relationships. And I'm not saying it's necessarily a bad thing. I think it's fair to say modern Americans are more interested in personal relationships probably than any prior point in American history. A piece of evidence is the fact that we now have armies of therapists and counselors, right, to help us. We go to counseling and therapy to help with our relationships. And in general, that's a good thing. And what is it that everyone despises within their own personal relationships, whether it's a romantic relationship or a close friendship or a family member? We hate being used. Right? I mean, that will destroy any kind of relationship. When someone doesn't really care about you, but they're just using you for their own purpose, for their own advantage or something like that. And yet think of what modern progressive government does. It uses people.
Right.
That is the very definition of being a progressive. Means we in government are going to use these people just in the way that a clock designer uses screws and bolts and springs and gears and things like that. We are the springs and the gears to be assembled, to be put around while they run their experiments. Think of the realm of education, for example. They've been running an experiment basically for a century on different theories of progressive education. You send your kids over to this government school because we're running an experiment and we want to see how your Johnny or Janie, right, are going to be affected by this latest theory of education.
But all trying to turn them into that same mold of clay.
That's right.
And if we go back to the pencil example, at one point, Department of Education, government decided that number 2 pencils are the perfect pencil, right? They're the closest to the ideal pencil. If you're talking about Socrates' allegory of the cave,
right?
The shadow of the number 2 pencil is the pencil you're seeing on the wall.
That's right.
And so now they're trying to turn everybody into that number 2 type graphite.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, the number 2 refers to the hardness of the graphite in the pencil, and now everybody has to be that type of graphite, and we have to turn into that. And what do you do with all the rest of the graphite? If the government doesn't find other uses for it,
I'll tell you what you do. You give them Ritalin and tell them to sit there in their desk and shut up, right?
But I think about going back to iPencil. We have that piece of metal at the top, and then there's an extra piece of brass.
Right.
And what if somebody decides that piece of brass isn't necessary? It's an extra cost. It costs us an extra 2 cents on every pencil to make. It's an unnecessary cost. We're going to get rid of it.
Right.
It's the same thing with people. If that extra gear isn't necessary, if we can make this gear a little bit bigger, a little bit stronger, we don't need that other gear, get rid of it. And it's the same thing with people. So let's take that back to a conversation we had during the last podcast, which was, what is the only reason that separated America from Germany as the progressives really led us down that path in the late 1800s and early 1900s into Woodrow Wilson?
Well, in fact, let's be real clear. American intellectuals, scholars, academics, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, they were studying German theorists.
Right.
That's who they were studying. The Germans were studying German theorists. They too were right. They were learning from their own philosophers, their own theorists, and one group ends up becoming Nazi Germany. The other group ends up they end up becoming the New Deal, which has all kinds of problems. But it was not the Holocaust. They weren't building death camps and shoving people into ovens. And what separates them? Why? How did these two different groups go from studying the same set of ideas, central planning, progressivism, and one becomes one of the most murderous regimes in history, the other becomes this big, bloated, wasteful, inefficient government, but not nearly as murderous? And the answer is one has a wisely designed constitution.
Right.
The Americans do. It's not a perfect constitution. It's just really darn good compared to every other constitution that's actually been created. And it does wise things, like it separates powers. It makes it really hard for a popular fad like central planning to just sweep over, wash over, and take over all the powers of government. You have a Senate, for example, where on any given election cycle, only a third of the Senate is actually up for election. 2/3 of the senators are not up for election, right? And so it makes our government, it's not immune to change, but it's slow. It's resistant to it. It makes change really slow. Whereas if you're in Germany, they adopt a new constitution and implement this kind of central planning right into the foundation of the government, the Third Reich that they create. So you're right. Preserving our Constitution is essential. It's indispensable for preserving an American way of life, a free way of life in which we can make our own choices, live the way we want to live. And this might be sort of here as we start to wind up, a big concluding topic to put out there for our listeners, and that is these two options. There are really two basic options when we think about living. One is to live freely, and people make their own choices. And when people live freely, some of them are going to make some bad choices. They are. They're going to do some stupid things. They're going to do some irresponsible things. It's going to happen. But that also means they're free to improve their lives. They're free to be creative, to be entrepreneurial, to try to provide a better future for their kids than they had themselves. And very often, many of our fellow citizens will say, well, you can't allow people to live freely because some of them might not take care of their children. Some of them might not educate their children properly or feed their children properly or give them the right kinds of medicines when they're sick. Therefore, we want central planning, which is the other basic way to live. And a lot of freedom folks feel this burden, right? When they get pressed on, well, what do you do about the person who doesn't teach their own kids well, right? Meaning the burden of proof is always on the freedom side.
Right.
I would suggest that we turn that burden of proof around. Look at all the injustices, all the terrible things that have been done, the horrific things that have been done in the name of central planning. Shame on them. I'm talking about all the way from murderous regimes, communist and fascist regimes, even down to democratic socialist societies that have misserved children with socialist education, socialist housing, socialist ways of life. I mean, think about our own schools here in the United States, public schools over the last, going all the way back 75 years or more, of the great disservice that has been done to hundreds of millions of children in the United States. The burden should be on those people, on people who support that. Shame on you, using force to come in and control so much of other people's lives. If someone's really worried about education, the best thing they can do is focus on the education of their own children. Make sure
Right.
that that's really good.
And on that same note, if you think about it in the same way, the burden should not be on proving that the Constitution is just. The burden should not be on us as freedom people to prove that the Constitution was a good thing. Look at the regimes that were coming progressive around the turn of the 20th century, up until the 1930s. Where would we have been
Right.
without that Constitution? And let's be clear. In America, the Holocaust, if there had been a Holocaust that had happened because we didn't have a Constitution, it wouldn't have been against the Jews. There were some serious injustices happening in this country.
Right.
There's no one's arguing that. No one's saying that the founders were perfect or anybody else along the way was perfect. But if you want to say that not everybody is entitled to the right to life, to liberty, to property, to pursuit of happiness, there's no doubt you can figure out who the groups in this country that would have been.
There would have been a racist Holocaust.
Yes.
Here, a racist genocide in the United States.
And
I think you're right.
And if that's the case, burden of proof isn't on us.
Right.
That is your proof.
Right.
Burden of proof is right there. The Constitution is the only thing.
And this might be, this is such a key point here for our audience members to take away. Those ideas enshrined in the Declaration of Independence, universal, timeless, true ideas, moral ideas, that every human being has a natural right to their own life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, to their own person, their own private property, and a constitutional republic whose very purpose is to protect those rights. That is the moral high ground. Mm-hmm. There is no need to apologize for that, to defend that. That is the moral high ground. Our point of view should be shame on anyone who rejects it.
Right.
Shame on you. Why would you reject that beautiful moral truth?
I think that's a great place to leave it. I really, really hope that people get that. I hope that they're continuing to watch the toolbox videos on the progressive idea and starting to put these things together. And I think we'll continue to try to do that. But we really do have the high ground here, and people sometimes just need that reminder.
So I'm gonna offer a little reminder here right at the end. Progressivism means central planning. Progressivism is central planning. So when you hear someone, whether it's politicians out there or friends around a fire pit at night, when you hear people praising progressivism, they're praising central planning.
Until next time, nos sumus custodes.
Nos sumos custodes.